title of my presentation is Our Empathetic Lord. What I'm going to talk about here are ways that we know that Jesus was empathetic towards the people that he was around as he went through his life, and a couple of examples. Empathy is what happens when we feel what someone else is feeling. There are not a lot of examples in the New Testament in which the author said Jesus felt so-and-so's pain in the same way that Bill Clinton famously said, "I feel your pain," many years ago. But, and in fact, I don't know of any other than possibly when he was on the cross, when they did describe the suffering that he went through and the pain he was going through because of our shame and our guilt that he took upon himself. However, what I'm going to talk about today are one specific example and just a couple other examples briefly of instances where it appears that Jesus empathized or was feeling what the other person was feeling. He did display empathy throughout his life. The woman at the well is a fairly well-known example. This particular woman would only come out to get water at the well either late in the evening or early in the morning because she felt so much shame. She had been and disgraced. She'd been disgraced because she had been divorced multiple times. This was something that Jewish men were allowed to do for almost any reason, divorce someone, even if they just wanted to move on to somebody else. So she was basically an outcast of society, so she didn't feel she could even come to the well anytime other than when nobody else was there. Jesus met her there, saw her, acknowledged her, and talked to her, showing that he did know what she was feeling and understood the shame that she felt. There was a prostitute, at least that's one theory, is that she was a prostitute who washed Jesus' feet with her hair and oil. Again, he did acknowledge her. He invited her into his life, and I believe she became part of his life. Zacchaeus is the one I'm going to talk about the most today. What makes Zacchaeus such a compelling and empathetic story? Well, Zacchaeus was a tax collector, meaning that he worked for the Roman government, but he was a Jew. So he collected money from his own people to give to the government that had conquered his native people, the Jewish people. So they considered him to be a traitor, and he was despised by his own people. However, despite that, he was actually very wealthy because he did get to keep some of the taxes that he collected from his own people. And as a result, he had to feel a lot of shame. And he probably just hid in the crowd. He was a very short man, it says, very small man. And so he probably just kind of blended into the crowd. He didn't want people to notice him because he knew how much they despised him and hated him. So he just probably blended into the crowd and felt totally misunderstood. Interestingly, he nonetheless was excited to see Jesus. There had to be something about Jesus, the ability he must have had to convey that he did feel and understand your emotions, the emotions that the people around him were feeling, that Zacchaeus and probably everyone else picked up upon. How do we know Zacchaeus was excited to see Jesus? For one thing, he ran ahead of the crowd. Jesus was surrounded by a throng of people that were walking with him. I don't know if it was hundreds or dozens or thousands, but it was a lot of people. And because Zacchaeus was so short, Jesus would probably have not even been able to see him. And Zacchaeus would not have been able to see Jesus if he didn't run ahead of the crowd and put some distance between him and them. I kind of picture this small guy just kind of excitedly running ahead of the crowd so he can get a chance to actually see this amazing Jesus. And to even further distinguish himself and give himself an even better chance to see Jesus, he climbed a tree. So he got high enough up in the tree that he could look down when Jesus walked by and get a clear view of him. And of course, Jesus could look up and see him as well. So what did Jesus do when he saw Zacchaeus? Well, the first fairly obvious thing he did is that he looked at him. Probably looked him right in the eye, saw Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus knew that Jesus did see him. And then he called him by name. He looked up and said, Zacchaeus, come down from the tree. I know how special I feel when somebody remembers my name, who I maybe have only met briefly a few times, but they take the time and effort to care to remember my name. Zacchaeus had not even met Jesus, and yet Jesus knew him by name. That had to make him feel, again, that Jesus really saw him and knew him and understood what he was feeling. And then the last thing Jesus did is he invited himself over to dinner. Kind of remarkable. What that meant is Jesus entered into his life. So he looked at him, he called him by name, and he didn't just walk away and leave Zacchaeus to live alone the rest of his life. Jesus actually entered into Zacchaeus' life. The question is, did Jesus know and feel what Zacchaeus felt? I think the answer to that is yes. And did he respond in a way that showed Zacchaeus that he did? Again, I think the answer is yes. Did Jesus have to think it through, or did he just know what Zacchaeus felt? There's a lot of fascinating research that's going on into how our brain works and how our brain is able to almost instinctively feel empathy for other people just by looking at them, just by looking at their facial expressions, whether they feel joy, happy, sadness, extreme pain. And when we see that, we don't really have to think about what it is they're going through specifically. We may not even know what it is. We just instinctively feel empathy, or we feel what they're feeling. So since we don't have to think to feel empathy, I don't think Jesus probably was able to just immediately look at Zacchaeus and feel Zacchaeus' excitement at seeing him, his shame at what he had chosen to do for a living, and his betrayal of his own people. And by looking at him and calling him by name, I think Jesus was able to convey that he felt those things. So in summary, I do think Jesus showed empathy to Zacchaeus in this story, and that we can model our lives after what he did. We can look at someone. If someone is in obvious distress, or you're passing someone on the street who's crying, we can either walk by and not pay any attention to them, or we can actually look at them and feel somewhat what they're feeling. We can call them by name if we know their name, or we can ask them their name. And that, again, conveys that you care and that we do empathize with them. And lastly, we can enter into their life. As a professional counselor in the future, I don't think it would be appropriate for me to invite myself over to one of my clients' houses for dinner. But when they're in my counseling office, I have to be willing to enter into their life with them so that I can really feel and understand why they feel and how they feel the things that they feel. So look at them, call them by name, and enter into their life. Thank you.